Hello guys, that's the video about the Primo de Rivera and his dictatorship. Today we're going to be talking about what he has done and what were the consequences of his reign. Thank you for watching. So let's begin. Following the declaration of the 1876 Constitution, alternative government system was established, which was a constitutional monarchy that unfortunately proved ineffective to solve the many issues that arose during this period. There was a lot of corruption and a lot of instability during the elections. More specifically, there was a practice of rural caciquismo in which local bosses made sure the desired election results took place by rigging the electoral lists. In addition, the de turno system failed to address the concerns of the numerous competing voices, some new, like socialism, anarchism, workers' movement, and some old, monarchy, the church, regionalism, and the military. The result of it was political instability and social violence. There were assassinations, bombs, strikes, military disasters, the loss of Cuba, Puerto Rico, Philippines during the American War in 1898. You can see it on your left, as well as humiliation in Morocco that we're gonna basically talk about later, and increasing calls for autonomy from Catalonia and growing unrest in the Basque provinces. As the 19th turned to the 20th century, everybody seemed to agree that there was a need for national regeneration. It was the buzzword, but people couldn't agree on what it meant. By the 1920s, the dream of national regeneration was gone and seemed as an illusion to many Spaniards as the failure of restoration politics occurred, with governments changing faster than the seasons, with a diet of labor wars and terrorism, and with Catalan demands for autonomy now extending to separation. However, what triggered Primo's power grab was not a political, social, or regional unrest, but the fallout from a festering Moroccan nightmare. It was an armed conflict fought from 1921 to 1926 between Spain, later joined by France in 1924, and the Berber tribes of the Rif region of northern Morocco, some local tribes. It was a war against tribes Spain just couldn't win for a long time, and which was pretty demanding itself. It was originally considered fresh and merry war, as Kaiser Wilhelm II expected the First World War to be, and was actually planned to end it shortly. However, it turned out to be quite a humiliation for Spain. It was pretty cruel from both sides. From Moroccan side, for example, the massacre of Monte Arruy happened when 2,000 soldiers of the Spanish army were killed after they surrendered, following the 12-day siege. The atrocities subsequently committed by the Spanish Army of Africa, by some historians, are argued to be triggered by a compulsive spirit of revenge of this and other massacres, and the desire to exact retribution on the rebel tribe. From a Spanish side, you can probably see the picture, and you've guessed it, that's pretty cruel, and that's Spanish soldiers holding the decapitated heads of Moroccan soldiers. Beginning in 1924, the Spanish used chemical weapons during the conflict, despite signing the Geneva Protocol that prohibited the use of chemical and biological weapons. Some researchers have cited the Spanish chemical weapons as the main reason for widespread cancer occurrence in the Rif region, which is still the highest in Morocco. There are strong indicators that the cancer is caused by the gases that were used against the resistance in the north. At the same time, historian Juan Pando pointed out that the areas of France and Belgium, which were gassed far more heavily during the World War I, do not have abnormal cancer rates. Miguel Alonso, Alan Kramer, and Javier Rodrigo wrote in the book Fascist Warfare. Although the Rif War was no fascist war, several methods used to pacify the population were applied. Apart from the deciding not to use chemical weapons, Franco's campaign to cleanse Spain resembled that in Morocco, intelligence gathering through torture, summary executions, forced labor, rape, and the sadistic killings of military prisoners occurred regularly. So let's talk about King Alfonso XIII. That's the Spanish king. After the 1917 revolution, he's scared of Bolshevism, and in public and private criticizes the constitutional system. He would even consider setting up a personal dictatorship in order to govern. The Spanish king was well aware of the coup preparation and did absolutely nothing to oppose it. Quite on the contrary, he shows his readiness for it and invites Primo de Rivera to form a military government. So you can see that is the photo of military directorate, which basically replaced the former apparatus. In the center you have Alfonso XIII. Right at the left side of him you have Primo de Rivera, and all those people above them are ministers of military directorate. There was no visible resistance to Primo de Rivera's coup d'etat. It was welcomed by a broad spectrum of public opinion, and nobody was ready to defend corrupt constitutional system affected by the crisis of authority. Prime Minister seemed to be actually relieved to pass the burden of government onto somebody else's hands. He even remarked that he had a new saint to commend himself, Saint Miguel Primo de Rivera, because he had released him from the nightmare of governing. It was a response of frightened dominant classes in society and transition between oligarchic and democratic politics. However, there was no surprise that the military coup d'etat took place in Spain, but that it arrived so late. Let's carry on. So, Primo de Rivera is appointed and he moves quite swiftly. He creates a military directorate with different armed forces representatives, which each replaced the Cortes. Suspended constitution, he ended jury trials and declared martial law all over the country. Press censorship is imposed, Catalan aspirations are repressed. In his manifesto, he addresses key ideas: paternalism and populism. He claims he's saving the country from the hands of the professional politicians who are responsible for the disaster of the war against America, and were rather ruling the country for their own benefit. Provided that the Spanish people were pretty tired of elitist politicians, the populism of Primo de Rivera was pretty welcomed. The dictator, unlike any other dynastic politicians, possessed charm, he possessed sympathy, spoke the language of the street, and did not attempt to conceal the vulgarity of his manners or his fondness of celebrations, alcohol, women. He even declared that he had learned the art of government at the casino of his natal town, Jerez. So he's appointed, and he does these things. The town councils all over the country are dissolved. Between September of 1923 and April 1924, generals took over as civil governors. The Communist Party and the CNT are banned. Hundreds of their soldiers are imprisoned. One of the innovations was try to find support among organized labor movement. Urban workers had years of gradual improvement in living standards and safe employment. Prices of basic commodities dropped. There were significant increases in public spending on education, social benefits, and health. Ambitious public works projects were undertaken, and workers' rights were defended in committees and courts. At the same time, key issues such as problems with land, social injustices, or agrarian reforms were ignored. In economics, it was the era of industrial expansion. All ideas of laissez-faire were abandoned and replaced by protectionism and state intervention. The idea of autarky was persistent. Economic nationalism, state control, high tariffs, support for national industry, and an enlargement of public sector. Such ideas were in line with Catalan bourgeoisie and were intended for the development of national resources and government investment in roads construction and overhauling of the railway system, as well as full employment and different programs for workers. In 1924, the National Council of the Economy was created to defend national agrarian and industrial interests. And here you have the results. Spain becomes one of the Europe's most heavily protected economies, with the third largest public sector, after the Soviet Union and Italy. Workers benefited, but of course the big winners were large companies with state assistance and monopolies. The examples of favoritism and bureaucratism were excessive. The durability of the regime and its economic programs depended on the confidence of the wealthy classes. You should remember this. Primo de Rivera is considered to be an abandonista and is prepared to either partially or totally pull out of Morocco. It is expensive and human resource demanding that the country just couldn't afford. Apart from the abandonista speeches before becoming the dictator, he also advocated for exchanging Gibraltar for Ceuta, which eventually costed him a post as military governor of Cadiz and the captain generalcy of Madrid in 1921. Despite such ideas, he was originally supported by Africanistas. Let me just point out, Africanistas were the soldiers of Spanish army that were located in Africa and advocated for the further stay there, just to be clear if you don't know. So, despite such ideas, he originally supported by Africanistas or colonial officers who thought the so-called liberal government would totally lose the war. Soon they would be outraged when the dictator, who they so much desired, ordered a general retreat to the new defensive lines and a repatriation of large numbers of conscripts. Francisco Franco, who was one of the leaders of the colonial officers, as well as other colonial officers, take the advantage of Primo's tour de protectorate in July 1924 to openly express their discontent. In almost every garrison that the dictator visited, the reception was marred by some snub and constant lack of respect. There was even the story that while visiting Africanistas in Ben Tiap, there was a very tense conversation before which Franco supposedly ordered all meals on the table before Primo de Rivera to be made of eggs. A certain way of foreign officers to show that the dictator is not a man. And you've guessed it, he supposedly doesn't possess a testicles. However, it was just a myth, to be fair, because the soldiers who were at the meeting don't recall this. However, it became possible to end the war, and fortune appeared to be on the dictator's side. The leader of the rebels in Morocco, Abd el-Krim, makes a tremendous mistake. While continuing harassing the Spanish troops with too much confidence, he also decides to invade the French Morocco. The outcome was a Franco-Spanish conference, which was held in Madrid, and which led to the French army from the south pushing the rebels into the Spanish sector. In May 1926, caught in the vice-like squeeze, outnumbered and outgunned, Abd el-Krim's forces were forced into unconditional surrender. Primo de Rivera had successfully crushed, in just a few months, a colonial rebellion which had been a nightmare since 1909. It is often argued that if Primo de Rivera had retired in 1925 or 1926, he probably would have gone in Spanish modern history as one of the most popular statesmen ever. According to the historian Francisco J. Romero Salvado, his problem was that he seemed unable to find the moment to go, and he began moves to perpetuate his rule by adopting a more civilian form of dictatorship. So it's all begun with the creation of the new party, Union Patriotica. You see On the left side, you see the coat of arms, sort of emblem of it, and on the right side, you see the people, obviously. And it was based on the mobilization of citizens of goodwill and order by the military directorate, nevertheless. In December 1925, the military directorate gave way to a civilian cabinet with the incorporation of technocrats into the government, and the establishment was announced in September 1926 of a National Consultative Assembly, a new Cortes, a new parliament, approved by a plebiscite whose objectives was to draft a new constitution that would be the foundation of the regime. So you see, he tries to create some solid ground for him to rule much more and to be soft but still a dictatorship. By creating UP, Primo de Rivera's hopes to turn the military dictatorship into a widely supported authoritarian regime. Was this attempt successful? Foreshadow now. Union Patriotica remained a pretty much artificial movement that rather served like a protective umbrella for thousands carrierists who were just eager for jobs and state protection, provided fascination with the Italian regime, and the case when Primo de Rivera and Alfonso XIII went to Italy, it can be explained by the fact that both were actually huge fans of what Mussolini was doing in his country, and they thought this new type of state should exist in Spain as well. Other similarities were parades and mass ceremonies, and even the attempts to establish a personality cult. The dictator, portrayed as an exceptionally talented leader, was hailed as the sentinel of the West, always alert to the Bolshevik threat, pretty popular claim in the 20th century dictators, the savior of the fatherland, the personification of perfect values of humanism, piety, and justice. If it seems that the regime and the party under Primo de Rivera were neither ideologically specific or unique, it would be a correct assumption. UP lacked any ideological coherence and could barely conceal its internal differences and contradictions under vague ideas of monarchism, patriotism, and anti-communism. As a matter of fact, the membership of UP began to fall dramatically from 2 million in August 1924 to 600 million in December, 600,000, not too much, in December 1929. So you can see that it's not that successful, and even though they managed to gather some people in the beginning, it starts to fall, which is a proof that the party was not successful. Unlike, let's say, the Bolshevist party in Soviet Union, which was experiencing their growth throughout its history, or Nazi party, let's say. So let's get back to the National Assembly we mentioned, and that was established by the dictator. It was established to create a new constitution and other purposes as well. It turned out to be a complete failure. Why? Due to the lack of ideology and various disagreements. Due to the fact that Primo de Rivera lacked ruthlessness. That's simple as that. The draft of the constitution that was made through the National Assembly favored a position intermediate between an authoritarian and liberal formula, a compromise that didn't please the majority of people. After 3 years of constant disagreements, the following was decided. Cooperative chamber would be created and would consist of representatives of the state, provinces and municipalities, as well as delegates of social classes and UP. Half are appointed, other half is elected through universal male suffrage. So it's important to understand, despite some left-leaning social policies towards workers that Primo is promoting, he still is supporting this patriarchy model. You must understand, and that's why the election must be held only through universal, yes, but male suffrage. Also, it would have just a little more of power than advisory powers, as the executives were only responsible to the monarch. So here are the consequences of this. The new project is attacked and rubbished by press. Almost all dissidents of the country, and even Primo himself, criticize it and find it too authoritarian. Can you believe it? Even the main dictator, probably just in public, but still claims that it is too authoritarian. Socialists of different kinds refuse to take part in it, so you end up in a situation where you have the National Assembly, the main party, but still the draft of the constitution that it is produced, nobody likes it. It's not popular. According to the historian Eduardo González Calleja, it was a purely transitory chamber from which no legitimacy would be born, but which, in any case, destroyed the image of the dictatorship as a provisional regime and opened the way to the constitution of an authoritarian regime of a clearly liquidianist character, which went from being a temporary state of exception to becoming a conscious enterprise of liquidation of the liberal parliamentary regime. After the failure to establish a new constitution, the political uncertainty begins. This leads to criticism from different kinds of people, like liberal intelligentsia, middle class, students, professors. Many of them fled to the Republican movement. One of the few things that could have saved Primo's situation back then was to either back down or to get back to a ruthless dictatorship. But he picked neither of those options. And that's exactly what made the collapse of the regime inevitable. Another source of the opposition was from Catalonia. As you probably remember, Primo was very connected to that region because he once was the the leader of the region, let's say. Provided that the dictator supported central and patriotic position, meant that the regime had banned any language or symbols but those of Castilla for official purposes. Originally, the support for the coup was offered by leading members of the Liga Regionalista, I hope I pronounced it correctly, sorry, Spanish people, who gradually lost their support as the main representative of Catalan nationalism, while being replaced by left-wing Catalan Republicans who were definitely not fans of Primo de Rivera. The active support for the military coup offered by leading members of the Liga Regionalista lost that group its credibility as the main representative of Catalan nationalism. Hence, that role was monopolized by left-wing Catalan Republicans, who are not fans of Primo. And what I'm trying to say is, he step by step loses the support, the foundation of his regime. So it's the idea that the revolution or the change of the regime happens overnight is wrong, because many little details lead to that change. However, most threatening for the regime by many historians was the growing opposition within the army, and you probably guessed it, from Africanistas, of course, but not just from them. However, as we mentioned before, the successful campaign of 1925 occurred, which made it easier not to just reconcile with officers, but even to promote them to key positions. For instance, Francisco Franco himself was appointed in 1928 to be in charge of the military academy at Zaragoza. This can be viewed as the way of pacification of the ones who didn't and probably don't agree with the policies. Other military members were quite angry at Primo de Rivera for a few reasons. First, attempts to cut down the military budget, reduce the inflated officer corps, and deal with the promotion system. About that more specifically, the Junteros defended the closed scale or strict promotion by seniority, which means the older you serve, the higher on the rank you are. Africanistas supported advancement war merits. Primo tries to solve it by offering a promotion by special selection carried out by junta. For the record, they were mostly appointed by himself, with past and senior generals. Hence, he neglected their opinion, which they obviously didn't like. This is an important thing because it was seen as an act of favoritism and arbitrary decisions, and opposed particularly by aristocratically dominated artillery corps, where promotion had always been by seniority. You can probably guess that such a discontent would inevitably lead to another coup d'etat, you've guessed it. So there are few coups related to military, in particular. So attempt number one, on 24th of June 1926, two veteran generals, Baylor and Aguilaram, the later one is located on your screen on the left, in close touch with some old politicians, as well as even some Republicans and anarcho-syndicalists, tried to stage a coup to restore 1876 constitution, abolished by Primo. It was a total disaster and was pretty easily stopped by authorities. Primo even fined the conspirators and neither killed them nor sent them away. Attempt number two, so-called Silver Medal. Coup organized by the head of the Conservative Party, Jose Sanchez Guerra. He is on your right side. It relied, as the previous time, on the combination of forces. Members of the old governing classes, anarcho-syndicalists, and army officers. Guerra lands in Valencia, expecting to lead a military revolt. However, at the last minute, most officers involved in the plot hesitate, which gives the government time to stop the coup. The rebellion was only successful among artillery officers, and these only gained the upper hand in a small town of Ciudad Real. The uprising was easily put down. It becomes clear that Primo's grip over the country is fading away. He only dissolved by decree the artillery corps, but couldn't punish the main conspirator, as Sanchez Guerra was found by military court as not guilty. So you don't have the proper circumstances yet, but still the control, the grip is fading away, and that is pivotal at this point actually. So finally, the gold medal and the third attempt, let's say. And the reason of why it became successful was the fact that it came at the same time as the economic depression of 1929. It brought a sharp drop in exports and rise in prices. The devolution of national currency, peseta, shook the economic confidence of economic circles and of the whole regime. Now we can see that the situation becomes worse. Not the attacks from the left, but the withdrawal of the support from the right, which can be argued doomed the regime to destruction. Not agreeing with a more progressive taxation, Primo wanted to do, landowners and industrialists refused to contribute loans and credit that Primo was so desperate to raise in order to solve the problem of budget deficit caused by a huge crisis and the lack of reserves to fall back on. They lost confidence in regime and were not and didn't want to be prepared to pay for the economic crisis. Finally, our glorious king. Our king is also wants to dissociate himself from Primo. He had his reasons to do so. Alfonso was well aware that Primo's growing unpopularity was involving the monarchy himself as well. He wants to escape the consequences and suddenly thinks that if he diminishes the dictator, he would be perceived by people as the liberator, also washing away some responsibility from 1923. Secondly, the king quite regrets the missing the old order. Unlike King Victor Emmanuel in Italy, which is liked by both Alfonso and Primo, as I mentioned before, probably, our king is clearly losing to the latter one in terms of charisma and popularity, and seems to be playing secondary role. He can't no longer dissolve the parliament and neither form nor dismiss cabinets. So he's pretty limited, you probably can see. King was against a few things that Primo did, that we mentioned before. Dissolving the artillery corps, establishing a national assembly and military decrees. Yet there was nothing he could do as long as there were economic and military successes. However, you see the crash, and when the crisis hits, Alfonso begins approaching members of old governing elites to find alternative. He was also well aware that the coup is being organized by General Patet, military governor at Cadiz, who seemed to have the support of many garrisons in the south and the sympathy of the Captain General of the region. Alfonso, brother-in-law, actually. So Alfonso used the existing economic downturn combined with discontent growing within the army to force Primo de Rivera to retire. In January of 1930, Primo, who at that time had diabetes combined with alcoholism, writes personally to the Captain General, so I would say the local governor of each region of Spain, to find out whether he still can count on them, and he hopes that they would offer their support. It was the last desperate attempt to cling to power. After all, reply negatively and say no, we are not gonna support you. Primo de Rivera, whose source and foundation of power was military, resigns on 28th of January 1930. He would die in exile in a small hotel in Paris just 2 months later. That's how the rule of one of the most curious and peculiar dictators of the century ended. Thank you very much for watching this video. It was a great pleasure for me. Subscribe if you want to, because I look forward to post much more videos regarding historical changes and anything interesting. Thank you very much.